Hello guys and welcome back, it's JJ here. I'm coming back to you today with another one of my audiobook series of the book that I've been reading, which is on your screens now, should be. If you're new around here, please subscribe, like and ding the bell so you get notifications. Keep showing me the support so I can keep doing this stuff for you. This is going to be episode 3, and I'm doing these in 20-minute segments. I will be starting this week from page 566 if you want to follow along with me. He was, of course, not yet committing himself to anything, but the two-front war, which had always been anathema, was now being actively entertained. Paradoxically, having advocated since the 1920s a showdown with the Soviet Union to destroy Bolshevism and win Lebensraum, Hitler had now come back to the idea of a war against Russia for strategic reasons, to force his erstwhile would-be friend Britain, now stubbornly holding out against the odds, to terms. The ideological aim of smashing Bolshevism, though apparently invoked by Hitler as part of his reasoning, was at this point secondary to the strategic need to get Britain out of the war. It was a sign of the difficulties that Hitler had manoeuvred himself into. Britain would not play his game. But the military lesson he kept saying she would have to be taught, and which the German public now awaited, would be, he knew, a hazardous affair. So he was now moving to a step he and most of his generals did not disagree, thought less dangerous: an attack on the Soviet Union. In fact, the Army Command, worried about the build-up of Soviet troops in southern Russia in connection with Stalin's increasing pressure on the Balkan states, had already in mid-June added a further 9 motorized divisions to the 15 divisions previously designated for transfer to the east. And on the 3rd of July, Halder, without any orders from Hitler, but following indications evidently passed on to him by Weizsäcker in the Foreign Office, showed himself ready to anticipate the change in direction, to work towards the Führer, when he deemed it appropriate to have the possibilities of a campaign against the Soviet Union tested. The Chief of Staff, ahead of Hitler at this point, raised, with his operational planners, the requirements of a military intervention which will compel Russia to recognize Germany's dominant position in Europe. Hitler was still avoiding a final decision on Britain, but it was with the impression that Lord Halifax's official spurning of his peace offer in a broadcast speech on the evening of the 22nd of July amounted to England's final rejection that he left for what was to prove the last time, for Bayreuth, to see next day a performance of Götterdämmerung. The die is cast, wrote Goebbels, we're tuning press and radio to a fight. In fact, the die had not been finally cast. Hitler remained unsure how to proceed. He had long since convinced himself of what German propaganda was trumpeting. It was he who wanted peace. Churchill, backed by the Jewish plutocracy, was the warmonger, the obstacle to triumph. While in Bayreuth, Hitler saw the friend of his youth days, August Kubizek, for the last time. Hitler told Kubizek, as gullible as ever, that the war had hindered all his great plans for rebuilding Germany. I did not become Chancellor of the great German Reich in order to wage war, he said. Kubizek believed him. Probably Hitler believed himself. He went from Beirut to the Obersalzberg. While he was there, the army leadership learnt from Raeder that the navy could not be ready for operations against England before the 15th of September. The earliest date for an invasion, depending on the moons and the tides, was the 26th of that month. If that date proved impossible, the invasion would have to be put off until the following May. Braustich doubted that the navy could provide the basis for an invasion in the autumn. In fact, the navy had concluded that it was highly inadvisable to attempt to invade at any point that year, and was extremely sceptical about the prospects of an invasion at all. Halder agreed with Braustich in eliminating the notion of an operation during bad weather. But they foresaw disadvantages, military and political, in a postponement to the following year. They considered possibilities of weakening Britain's overseas position through attacks on Gibraltar, Hafia, and Suez, support for the Italians in Egypt, and inciting the Russians to move on the Persian Gulf. An attack on Russia was rejected in favour of the maintenance of friendly relations. Hitler, meantime, had been privately consulting Jodl. On the 29th of July, he asked the chief of the Wehrmacht directional staff about deploying the army in the east, and whether it might be possible to attack and defeat Russia in that very autumn. Jodl totally ruled it out on practical grounds. In that case, Hitler said, absolute confidence was needed. Feasibility studies were to be undertaken, but knowledge confined to only a few staff officers. Remarkably, in fact, the Wehrmacht had not waited for Hitler's orders. The army, Jodl was later to remark, had already learned of the Führer's intentions at the stage when these were still being weighed up. An operational plan was therefore drawn up even before the order for this was given, and already in July, as he later put it in his own initiative, Major General Bernhard von Lossberg from the National Defense Department, headed by Major General Walter Vollemont, had begun work on an operational study for a Russian campaign. The draft plan was at this stage merely intended to be held in readiness for the point at which it might be needed. Hitler's discussion with Jodl indicated that this point had arrived. Lossberg, two other members of Vollemont's staff, and Vollemont himself were sitting in the restaurant car of the special train Atlas in the station at Bad Reichenhall when Jodl came from the Berghof to report on his discussion with Hitler. According to Vollemont, the consternation at what they heard, meaning the dreaded war on two fronts, gave rise to an hour of bitter argument. Jodl countered by stating Hitler's opinion that it was better to have the inevitable war against Bolshevism now, with German power at its height, than later, and that by autumn 1941 victory in the East would have brought the Luftwaffe to its peak for deployment against Britain. Whatever the objections, it is impossible to know whether Vollemont was exaggerating them in his post-war account. The feasibility studies under the code name Aufbau Ost, build up in the East, were now undertaken with the greatest sense of urgency. 2 days later, on the 31st of July, Hitler met his military leaders at the Berghof. Raeder repeated the conclusion his naval planners had reached, that the earliest date for an invasion of Britain could be no sooner than the 15th of September, and favoured postponing it until the following May. Hitler wanted to keep his options open. Things would become difficult with the passing of time. Air attacks should begin straight away. They would determine Germany's relative strength. If results of air warfare are unsatisfactory, invasion preparations will be stopped. If we have the impression that England are crushed, and that effects will soon begin to tell, we shall proceed to the attack, he stated. He remained sceptical about an invasion. The risks were high, so however was the prize, he added, but he was already thinking of the next step. What if no invasion took place? He returned to the hopes Britain placed in the USA and in Russia. If Russia were to be eliminated, then America too would be lost for Britain because of the increase in Japan's power in the Far East. Russia was the factor on which Britain is relying the most. The British had been completely down. Now they had revived. Russia had been shaken by events in the West. The British were clutching on, hoping for a change in the situation during the next few months. He moved to his momentous conclusion: remove Russia from the equation. Halder's notes retain Hitler's emphasis. With Russia smashed, Britain's last hope will be shattered. Germany, then, will be the master of Europe and the Balkans. Decision: Russia's destruction must therefore be made a part of this struggle. Spring 1941. The sooner Russia is crushed, the better. Attack achieves its purpose only if Russian state can be shattered to its roots with one blow. Holding part of the country alone will not do. Standing still for the following winter would be perilous, so it is better to wait a little longer, but with the resolute determination to eliminate Russia. If we start in May 1941, we would have 5 months to finish the job. Unlike the anxious reactions on the occasions in 1938 and 1939, when the generals had feared war with Britain, there is no indication that they were horror-struck at what they heard. The fateful underestimation of the Russian military potential was something Hitler shared with his commanders. Intelligence on the Soviet army was poor, but the underestimation was not solely the result of poor intelligence. Airs of disdain for Slavs mingled easily with contempt for what Bolshevism had managed to achieve. Contact with Soviet generals in the partition of Poland had not impressed the Germans. The dismissal showing of the Red Army in Finland, where the inadequately equipped Finns had inflicted unexpected and heavy losses on the Soviets in the early stages of the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, had done nothing to improve its image in their eyes. Not least was the apparent madness which had prompted Stalin to destroy his own officer corps. Whereas an attack on the British Isles remained a perilous undertaking, an assault on the Soviet Union raised no great alarm. A true lightning war could be expected here. The day after the meeting on the Berghof, Hitler signed Directive No. 17, intensifying the air war and sea war against Britain as the basis for her final subjugation. He explicitly underscoring the sentence in the directive reserved for himself a decision on the use of terror bombing. The offensive was set to begin 4 days later, but was postponed until the 8th. It was again postponed on account of the weather conditions until the 13th. From then on, the German fighters sought to sweep the Royal Air Force from the skies. Wave after wave of attacks on the airfields of southern England was launched. Spitfires, Hurricanes, and Messerschmitts wheeled, arched, dived, and strafed each other in the dramatic and heroic dogfights on which Britain's survival at this point deepened. The early optimistic results announced in Berlin soon proved highly misleading. The task was beyond the Luftwaffe. At first, by the skin of their teeth, the young British pilots held out, then gradually won the ascendancy. Despite Hitler's orders that he alone was to decide on terror bombing, 100 planes of the Luftwaffe, acting, it seems, under a loosely worded directive from Goering, issued on the 2nd of August, had attacked London's East End on the night of the 24th of August. As retaliation, the RAF carried out the first British bombing raids on Berlin the following night. Hitler regarded the bombing of Berlin as a disgrace. As usual, his reaction was to threaten massive retaliation. "We'll wipe out their cities. We'll put an end to the work of these night pirates," he fumed at a speech in the Sportpalast on the 4th of September. He spoke with Goering about undertaking the revenge. From the 7th of September, the nightly bombing of London began. It was the turn of the citizens of Britain's capital to experience night after night the terror from the skies. The shift to terror bombing marked a move away from the idea of landing, which Hitler had never wholeheartedly favoured. Persuaded by Goering, he now thought for a while that Britain could be bombed to the conference table without German troops having to undertake the perilous landing. But, dreadful though the Blitz was, the Luftwaffe was simply not powerful enough to bomb Britain to submission. Between the 10th and 13th of September, there were signs that Hitler had gone utterly cold on the idea of a landing. On the 14th of September, he then told his commanders that the conditions for Operation Sea Lion, the operational plan to attack Great Britain, had not been attained. Meanwhile, the dogfights over southern England and the Channel coast intensified during the first fortnight in September, reaching a climacteric on Sunday the 15th. The Wehrmacht admitted 182 planes lost in the fortnight, 43 on the 15th alone. The horrors of the Blitz would continue for months to be inflicted upon British cities. Among the worst devastation, the bombing of Coventry on the night of the 14th of November, as the German onslaught switched to the industrial belt of the Midlands to strike at more manageable targets than London. But the Battle of Britain was over. Hitler had never been convinced that the German air offensive would successfully lay the basis for the invasion of which he was in any case so sceptical. On the 17th of September he ordered the indefinite postponement, though for psychological reasons, not the cancellation, of Operation Sea Lion. The peace overtures had failed. The battle for the skies had failed. Meanwhile, on the 3rd of September, the grant of 50 destroyers to Britain by the USA, a deal which Roosevelt had eventually pushed through, initially against much opposition from the isolationists, was, despite the limited use of the elderly warships, the plainest indication to date that Britain might in the foreseeable future be able to reckon with the still dominant military might of the USA. It was increasingly urgent to get Britain out of the war. Hitler's options were, in autumn 1940, still not closed off. There was the possibility of forcing Britain to come to terms through a strategy of attacks on her Mediterranean and Near Eastern strongholds. But, once that option also faded, Hitler was left only one possibility, the one that was in his view not only strategically indispensable, but embodied one of his most long-standing ideological obsessions. This point would not finally be reached until December 1940. By then, it would be time to prepare for the crusade against Bolshevism. And that is going to be it for this episode number 3 of Awesome Audiobooks. I want to thank everyone for their support, and please do leave a comment, subscribe if you're new around here for more of this, and I will see you in the next episode. Thank you. Bye.